Alright, we're about to reach the halfway point with this video. But before we get started, I want to very quickly address a mistake that I made in my last video. It's Joshua2508 actually pointed this error to me, so credit goes to him for catching it. For my review of the Daffy Duckaroo, I accidentally used footage not from the original black and white cartoon, but rather from a redrawn and recolorized version. And I happened to make a comment about how the animation felt particularly choppy. Well, that's the reason why, because it wasn't the original. Now, granted, the original cartoon's animation isn't the best of the Looney Tunes catalog or anything like that, but it is still smoother than the other version. So, that's my bad. I should have caught that, but I didn't. Now, I made mistakes in these videos before. Misspeaking, typos, cartoons being presented out of order, but I did feel the need to actually address this one in particular, because this was a mistake that actually affected my viewing experience and therefore had an effect, however mild, on my actual review. Now, I want to be clear that my rating of the cartoon is still the same, 6 out of 10, but if I had a chance to redo it, I would not have made a comment about how choppy the animation looks. So again, that was my mistake, and that's something that I should have double-checked. Alright guys, that's enough housekeeping. Let's just jump right in. The Wise Quacking Duck. This is once again Old School Daffy doing his Old School Daffy shenanigans. Although the gag in which Daffy shoves his head down his neck and tosses ketchup everywhere feels exceptionally cruel even for Looney Tunes. Not that that's a negative, it's actually an insanely funny bit. This one moves at a breakneck pace, and the victim of the week, Mr. Meek, which by the way is a great name, is a fantastic presence, and the gags are almost all bullseyes. Greetings, Bait. Why was this cartoon nominated for an Oscar? I honestly couldn't tell you. This is a fairly standard cartoon that's kind of amusing, but doesn't have that many laugh-out-loud moments. The eye bit was actually pretty good, but this is otherwise pretty run-of-the-mill. Inoffensive, but passable. Tokyo Jokio. Okay, so I feel like I shouldn't have to explain the problems with this one. Now, like I mentioned in the last video, I get the feeling that the blackface caricatures were done out of ignorance rather than malice. You cannot make that argument with this one. The whole entire point of this cartoon is to dehumanize and demoralize people based on their ethnicity. Now, granted, it is in the context of it being wartime, and, well, in war-era propaganda, that's what you do to the enemy, dehumanize them. So, yeah, the context makes it understandable, but understandable doesn't mean excusable. Even still, it wouldn't bother me that much. Indeed, other American propaganda cartoons of this era also caricaturized Germans, if propaganda like this wasn't also causing troubles for people back home. Not just Japanese Americans, but really any Asian Americans. So, how exactly am I supposed to judge this cartoon? Am I supposed to give it points for accomplishing exactly what it set out to do, especially when that thing it's trying to accomplish is reprehensible? Do I view this as a fascinating historical artifact and product of the time? I guess I can try to judge this on its artistic merits, but its merits are also inherently linked to its blatant racism, since the racism is the whole entire point. I guess I can also say that as a cartoon in and of itself, it's not really that funny. Even taking the blatant racism out of it, the gags are either so weak and poorly timed that they just fall flat, or they're just inferior versions of other gags told better elsewhere. Literally, one gag is just showcasing where the US is planning to store Admiral Yamamoto, and then it just cuts to a shot of an electric chair. That's not even really a joke, it's just stating that you wish that the leader of the enemy was dead. And still, maybe that might have been cathartic to viewers at the time, but at the same time, when this cartoon was released, Admiral Yamamoto was already dead, having been killed in battle. So yeah, it even fails at that very basic goal of providing catharsis. The only way this cartoon should be viewed is as a historical artifact, because basically, from every other angle, it is almost completely worthless. Oh, and this turned out to be Norm McCabe's last cartoon before he was drafted into the Army. Honestly, it must really suck to have your last cartoon made before leaving a studio be your worst cartoon. Yankee Doodle Daffy. I would kill to have an agent like Daffy, willing to basically kidnap someone and hijack his plane just to get him to hear you audition. What a trooper. Anyway, this one's got some great fast-moving energy, which helps it overcome the fact that this one isn't especially gag-heavy. The only thing I'm not sure about is the ending. Is the joke supposed to be that he's out of practice and that's why he's coughing? Or that he's actually not as talented as Daffy was having us let on? Or is this just a pop culture reference that I don't get? I don't know. It certainly doesn't ruin the cartoon, but it's an odd moment nonetheless. Jack Wabbit and the Beanstalk. A mostly forgotten Bugs Bunny cartoon that, while certainly not great, has Bugs doing his usual shtick and doing it pretty well. By far the standout gag in this is the dueling gag. The Aristocat. While the setup for this one may take a little bit too long, and the ending gag is a little weak, almost every other section of this cartoon is really funny. And it also features some of that twisted Chuck Jones sense of humor. Wakiki Wabbit. This has some utterly beautiful abstract backgrounds that really help sell this island as being foreign. Anyway, this one's pretty good, got a few laughs in here, although I would argue that it actually does too well of a job of making you sympathize with the two castaways here. I mean, these guys are established as being starving, so it's hard to blame them for wanting to eat bugs, but I guess it definitely fits Chuck Jones's more cynical and cruel style, but even still, this is pretty harsh. Porky Pig's Feet. The triumphant return of Frank Tashlin. And boy, howdy does he make a return. Filled to the brim with intelligent satire, and in particular, I just love the absurdity of the situation, where the hotel manager literally will not let Porky and Daffy leave until they pay their bill, but that means they're having to take up a room that he can't make any money off of because it's being taken up by two tenants who can't and won't ever be able to repay their bill. And the punchline is so unexpected and yet so hilarious just the same. Easily one of the most underrated Looney Tunes cartoons of all time. Tin Pan Alley Cats. Another Censored 11 cartoon. And much like Coal Black and the Seven Dwarfs, this is another cartoon made by Bob Clampett to showcase the love he had for black jazz culture. And it shows that off pretty effectively with some incredible and fast-moving music and excellent rhythm. Then, suddenly in the second half, Bob Clampett decided to bring back Wacky Land just so he could work in some more surreal imagery. While some of the animation is reused from Porky and Wacky Land, it is only parts of it. And enough time has passed since that cartoon has been made, and now that it's in color, so there is at least a technical reason for it being in the cartoon rather than simple laziness. And the black stereotype jokes are actually kept to a bare minimum in this one, besides the uses of blackface. So, unlike other Censored 11 cartoons, this one's actually quite a bit easier to get through. Really, my biggest issue with this cartoon is that there is kind of a disconnect between the first and second halves. Scrap Happy Daffy. I was kind of hoping this would be a cartoon about Daffy actually fighting Hitler, but a Nazi goat I guess is good too. And the portrayal of Hitler as a man-child is pretty funny. Anyway, there's a few good gags in here, like the mirror gag and the glasses gag. Hiss and Make Up. I think with a stronger and more established Looney Tunes character in these roles, a lot of these gags would feel a lot punchier, but this is still pretty good all on its own. A Corny Concerto. As a parody of Fantasia, it's pretty solid. It's fast-moving, although the first segment is clearly the better of the two. And I'm gonna be honest, I don't get the joke of Elmer losing more and more of his outfit as the cartoon goes on. Finn Catty. It's a battle of wits between a cat and a goldfish, and it's pretty entertaining. Bare basic setup and then gives way to a series of fast-moving slapstick gags, which really is all I'm asking for if the gags work, and the gags do work here. Falling Hair. By far one of the better wartime-era cartoons, because this one is actually a cartoon with a plot and with gags, rather than being merely a vehicle to sell war bonds. And the Gremlin is such a wonderful antagonist for Bug to go up against, namely because he's actually a threat to Bugs rather than Bugs merely walking circles around him. This also features the absolutely classic ran out of gas ending punchline that to this day still remains one of my favorite cartoon gags of all time. That being said, there is this bit. I mean, yikes. Yikes. I mean, I know it's not the cartoon's fault, but wow, did that joke age poorly. Inky and the Mina Bird. I guess I'm just not a fan of these Inky cartoons. But this is probably the best of the bunch so far. Some parts of it are still kind of dull, but I actually like the lion as a character in this one. He single-handedly elevates this one to watchable. Daffy the Commando. While the setup takes a bit too long, this is precisely what I wanted out of Scrap Happy Daffy. Daffy just being the epitome of chaos and torment against the Nazis. This is also probably my favorite iteration of the turn out those lights gag that we've had so far. An Itch in Time. Honestly, this one may be just a little bit too real. Getting an itch and not being able to scratch it is something that's really difficult to make funny, because it's a pain that pretty much everyone can sympathize with and relate to. It's still weird and bizarre and has its fair share of decent gags, especially the ending punchline, the "Hey, I may get to like this gag," and this gag where the dog antagonizes the cat into scratching his back. Puss in Booty. How's that for a title? Anyway, this is the final black and white cartoon for Warner Brothers. And I heard somebody say somewhere that this is like a Sylvester and Tweety cartoon if it was directed by Alfred Hitchcock. And yeah, I'd say that's a fair assessment. We get some really neat and experimental shots, and some experimenting with shadows, giving this almost a gothic feel at times. The main cat that we follow in this cartoon is actually far more evil and conniving than Sylvester. And this cartoon goes to great lengths to show just how devious he truly is, which makes him stand out among the Looney Tunes slew of pathetically inefficient villains. And I'll just say it, the ending punchline to this is as hilarious as it is genuinely shocking and mean. This cartoon is a masterwork, and another one that I feel doesn't get the attention it deserves. Little Red Riding Rabbit. Really, just a classic chase cartoon with several laugh-out-loud moments. And this cartoon's iteration of Red Riding Hood as a thoroughly annoying, shrill archetype means that she leaves an impact. Standout moments include this coal gag and the last straw gag. What's Cookin', Doc? This short might actually contain more live-action footage than you might think. Maybe it's a little lazy, but still, it is interesting to see the real footage of the Academy Awards from back in the day. Less forgivable, however, is the blatant recycling of footage from Hiawatha's Rabbit Hunt, simply to kill time. And honestly, this almost feels like it was made simply to complain about how Warner Brothers had not won an Oscar yet for their cartoons, which, I'm going to be honest, is really not a good look on their part. Meatless Fly Day. There's a few decent gags in here, most prominently the shoe gag, and it actually moves at a good solid pace, but honestly the spider is kind of annoying in this. And while I enjoy that Warner Brothers is doing more chase cartoons, it's getting to the point where I wish they would only stick with established characters for their chase cartoons. Tom, Turk, and Daffy. Well, if you need a Thanksgiving film to add to your yearly repertoire, this is certainly a good one to add. A great premise and non-stop hilarity as we have yet another Porky and Daffy chase cartoon. Interestingly, Daffy's personality here is almost a combination of his two most prominent characterizations, the zany and Daffy and the jerkish, selfish stool pigeon. Bugs Bunny and the Three Bears. I think there's an argument to be made here that this cartoon's plot delves a bit into postmodernism as the Three Bears try to exploit the Goldilocks story in order to get themselves a meal. Normally, I'd say this cartoon's pacing is a little off-kilter, but because we're spending the first couple of minutes watching the Three Bears, and they all have incredible larger-than-life personalities, that makes it fun to watch them bounce off of each other. And I have to admit, on my first viewing, I definitely didn't see the turn this cartoon took coming. And some of these jokes are a tad risque, to say the least. I Got Plenty of Mutton. The setup seems like it's going to be another Sam Sheepdog and Ralph Wolf prototype, but it's actually more accurate to say this is a prototype of Pepe Le Pew. And I have to ask, the ram has horns, and he's extraordinarily horny. Was that intentional? I hope so, because if it is, that's just genius. Also, the ending punchline is basically the same exact punchline as Some Like It Hot. 15 years before that film actually came out. The Weekly Reporter. Another one that's more interesting as a historical artifact than as an actual short. And some of the gags, punchlines, I just straight up don't get, but I'm sure it meant something to the audience members at the time who actually had to live through this period. Tick Tock Tuckered. This cartoon is a color remake of Porky's Bad Time Story, only with Gabby Goat replaced with Daffy Duck. And honestly, that one change does make this a little bit better. And the gags that are recycled, I think, are also timed just a little bit better this time around. Bugs Bunny Nips the Nips. Oh, yeah. Okay, let's talk about this one. Now, granted, this one's not quite as bad as Tokyo Jokio, mostly because this one actually has a few decent gags in here, like the plane gag and the ending gag where Bugs says that he can't stand the peace and quiet. Like, if you took the racial stereotypes out of it, I could actually see parts of this working really well. And I could also at the very least understand the appeal for the audience members back in the 40s, much like in Daffy the Commando, where they got to see Daffy go after the Nazis. But yeah, the racial stereotype jokes are in here, and they are bad. And like I said before, these kinds of stereotypes are less excusable than some of the ones that came before it, because they're made out of genuine malice, not simply ignorance. But like I said, the parts that are in here work okay, and honestly, if you're interested in wartime era propaganda cartoons, this is a must-watch just for its historical value. But even if the racism wasn't in here, this would still be relatively lowball Bugs. Swooner Crooner. Frank Tashland's cartoons might be some of the horniest cartoons you will ever see in the golden age of animation. Want proof? Just watch this one and I Got Plenty of Mutton back to back. Also, the ending of this cartoon basically all but states that Porky is gay. Russian Rhapsody. I really like this idea of Hitler being so confident in his abilities that he chooses to personally fly a bomber out to the USSR. Anyway, literally the whole point of this cartoon is to make Hitler look as silly as possible, and it very much succeeds at that goal. Also, if these old wartime cartoons have taught me anything, it's that A vehicles were bad and much worse than C vehicles. I don't even know what that means, but I learned it. Duck Soup to Nuts. More of Screwy Daffy messing around with Porky with lots of great gags. This was also the first time the duck season, rabbit season type of gag was used, although it was used by Daffy to try to trick Porky into thinking that he's an eagle. Angel Puss. Another Censored 11 cartoon, and also the only Chuck Jones cartoon of the bunch. This one features that typical Chuck Jones cruelty that has become a staple in his cartoons. But maybe the cartoon's a little bit too cruel, as the cartoon goes out of its way to make it clear that the main character didn't want to go through with drowning the cat, but did it reluctantly just because he was so poor that he didn't want to return the money that he was paid for doing it. And yet he gets absolutely tormented by the cat, even though the cat is the one that egged him on into doing it in the first place. Now, the idea for this cartoon isn't a bad one, but like I said, the cartoon makes the victim of the week too sympathetic for its own good to really work. Also, this features one of the most racist gags in the entire Looney Tunes catalog, where the cat literally puts a black man in a hypnotic trance simply by rubbing some dice together. Slightly Daffy. A more or less shot-for-shot remake of Scout Trouble back in 1939, except this one's in color. And while I like that cartoon just fine, I fail to see why it needed to be remade, especially if you're not actually going to do anything that different or unique with bringing this idea back. Hair Ribbon. Did Bob Clampett make a bet with someone that he could make an entire Bugs Bunny cartoon underwater or something? How can these characters breathe and talk underwater? Anyway, this one's a pretty decent Bugs Bunny chase cartoon, even if it can be a little bit too random for its own good. The other interesting thing to note about this cartoon is that there are basically two different endings. In both versions, the dog cries over having killed Bugs, and he cries out, "I wish I were dead." Bugs then pops up alive and says, "Do you mean it?" Then in the original theatrical cut, he hands the dog a revolver, and the dog shoots himself in the head. In the original director's cut, Bugs actually shoots him in the mouth himself. And while I definitely understand why the original cut was changed, I personally think the ending where Bugs shoots the dog is a lot funnier, but that's just a personal preference. I should quickly note that there are a few other minor differences between both versions, but honestly they're so minor I don't even really feel the need to go into them. Brother Bat. The opening begins with an earnest tribute to the women who worked in manufacturing jobs while the men were away fighting in the war. Then it commences into yet another cartoon which features an infant beating the crap out of Porky for absolutely no reason. Did Porky eat babies in a previous life or something? Anyway, the image of a baby using a cat as if it was a jump rope is something I didn't know I would ever see, but it got a laugh out of me. Also, there's this gag. Yeah, I'm not saying anything other than pointing it out. But overall, this is some pretty funny stuff. Hair Force. Bugs pretending to die just so he can guilt trip his enemies and make them cry will never not be funny to me. From Hand to Mouse. In some ways similar to The Lying Mouse from back in 1937, but this one takes its mean-spirited premise a little bit of a step forward like I wanted it to the first time around. And it also plays out like a standard Chuck Jones chase cartoon. Good stuff. Birdie and the Beast. The return of Tweety Bird, and they were apparently so sure that he would be a star after only 2 appearances, he even got his own title card. I mean, they were right, but still. Anyway, this is a standard Sylvester and Tweety cartoon, only if Tweety was more sadistic and self-aware. So yeah, it's pretty funny, with the fire hose gag in particular getting a big laugh out of me. Buckaroo Bugs. Here's an interesting specimen of a cartoon. And by that, I mean this is the only cartoon I can think of where Bugs is actually an out-and-out villain. I know I could probably complain about that, but it just works here. The gags really work here, and I like the glue gag, this gag in which Bugs tries to trick Ryder into thinking that he's robbing a train, and this hilarious Grand Canyon ending gag. Goldilocks and the Jivin' Bears. The last of the Censored 11 cartoons. And this one is okay, I guess. I mean, it's Friz Freleng trying to emulate Bob Clampett's jazz cartoons, only not as good. The music is still really good, and there's a few solid jokes, like the gag involving the wolf's feet. And if nothing else, in terms of racial sensitivity, this one's actually one of the tamest Censored 11 cartoons. But still, I think the combining the story of Goldilocks and Little Red Riding Hood was done better in The Bear's Tale. Plain Daffy. An incredible wartime propaganda cartoon that's far from just patriotic grandstanding. Frank Tashlin actually weaves together a perfect combination of narrative with surprising gravitas, with a bunch of zany, over-the-top jokes, managing to squeeze so much into 7 minutes, including an incredible ending punchline that the entire thing was building towards. Also, if you know anything about Tashlin's cartoons, you'd know that he's the perfect director to take on Mata Hari. Just fantastic work through and through. Lost and Foundling. I thought this was going to be just another cloying Sniffles cartoon. I was absolutely not expecting something this utterly twisted and mean. Sniffles' voice is still annoying, but at least this one has a plot with good gags, and actually a rather sweet ending without going into full-blown saccharine. Booby Hatched. This one's more pleasant and enjoyable than actually laugh-out-loud funny, but it is pleasant and enjoyable. Some of these gags are legit good, though, like this "stop will come out" gag, and "this is the saddest part of the picture" gag. The Old Gray Hair. Elmer gets to travel far, far, far into the future. That's right, all the way to the year 2000. Anyway, this is a cartoon in which the entire thing is building to a single joke, and that joke is a really good one. Right in the middle of the cartoon, it seemingly takes a surprisingly kind of quiet and contemplative turn as the quote-unquote dying Bugs reminisces on the good old days. At least until we get to the ending where it's revealed the entire thing was just a ruse so that Bugs could bury Elmer alive. Mean-spirited? Yes. Funny? Also yes. The Stupid Cupid. Another Hound Dog Frank Tashlin cartoon, and one that, whether intentionally or not, highlights just how terrifying the concept of Cupid would actually be. If he decides to make you fall in love with someone else, even if you and the other person are already married, or you fall in love with someone who wasn't also shot with Cupid's arrow, he would have the authority to do it. This cartoon is weird, but I mean that in the best way possible. Stage Door Cartoon. More really enjoyable Bugs and Elmer shenanigans, this time in a theater. I don't have much to say about this one except that it's bouncy, fun, and well executed. It just works. The ending of this cartoon is also hilarious as it goes full-blown meta by having the characters watch the cartoon that they're currently in. Lots of great stuff in here. Odorable Kitty. For years, I never knew that the first Pepe Le Pew cartoon was actually him trying to gain the affection of a male cat disguised as a skunk. I guess I could take the opportunity now to talk about the controversies surrounding this character. And that's, of course, the fact that Pepe is meant to be a joke based around the stereotype that Frenchmen are all womanizers who refuse to bathe. But, I don't know, I don't see the issue with it. I mean, after all, if the French are known for anything, it's their remarkable sense of humor. Alright, I swear I'll talk about the controversy surrounding this character, but in a little bit when he's actually in a starring role rather than being the antagonist. As for the cartoon itself, this is more of Chuck Jones doing his usual shtick of having a main character that you completely sympathize with, and yet they get put through the ringer through no fault of their own. It's cynical, but funny stuff. And actually, with Pepe being such an established character to us, the ending punchline actually comes off as a legit surprise nowadays. Air Meets Hair. Another anti-Nazi cartoon meant to make the Nazis look as silly and flamboyant as humanly possible. This one isn't the best one out there, namely because of the completely detached and out of nowhere shout out to Wagner about halfway through. But it's got some good laughs, like when Bugs disguises himself as Hitler, and also a poorly aged gag in which Bugs disguises himself as Joseph Stalin. Also, as a fun bit of trivia, this is the first cartoon in which Bugs says his famous line that he made a wrong turn at Albuquerque. Drafty Daffy. This is a cartoon that really could only be made during a time when draft dodging was seen as almost treasonous, especially during the back end of World War II. But honestly, knowing that the war in Europe was about to end honestly makes this cartoon even funnier, which is already an impressive achievement considering how hysterical this cartoon is. The facial expressions of the characters, especially Daffy, are hilarious and shows Bob Clampett once again at the top of his game. Hilarious from start to finish. The Unruly Hair. Frank Tashlin continues to be one of the most underappreciated Looney Tunes directors of all time. An absurdly overlooked Bugs Bunny cartoon that is almost pure kinetic energy. The jokes just keep piling on and they're all bangers. I'm assuming the reason this one that wasn't shown very often is because of a gag involving Esquire magazine, but that is pure speculation on my part. Trap Happy Porky. Relatively mild Chuck Jones work, but is mild, at least in this era, is still pretty good. The punchline is a little bit obvious, but it's executed decently enough. Life with Feathers. Sylvester's debut, and he enters the scene in such an overly demented and mean-spirited cartoon that goes above and beyond to make him suffer. Given this cartoon's entire premise is based around the concept of a bird trying to commit suicide, it's fair to say that this cartoon's not going to be for everyone's taste. But if you enjoy your comedy to be pitch black and your sense of humor is demented, this is an incredible treat. Fast-moving, zany, and utterly, utterly cruel. Behind the Meatball. What in the world kind of dog owner intentionally feeds her dog absolutely no meat? That's just cruel. And this cartoon also takes on a whole different feel when you remember that at the time this cartoon was released, meat had been rationed because of the war. I don't know if that makes this any better or worse, but that historical context does add a level of intrigue to it. Anyway, some good gags in here like the punching gag and the brain gag. Nothing great, but a perfectly good, solid chase cartoon. Hair Trigger. The first appearance of Yosemite Sam, and what an impression he makes. I think Bugs' personality, for some reason, just fits so well into the Old West, and Sam is an absolutely perfect foe for him. Sam was apparently created because the crew was worried that Bugs came across as a bully when he fought Elmer, and while I do think their cartoons together are just fine, I can kind of understand where they're coming from. Anyway, this one's got several incredible gags. By far my favorite is the ink gag. Mostly because if you take a few frames out of context, it actually does look like Sam's been shot. But once again, the ending punchline is just perfect. A rip-roaring old time. Ain't That Ducky? This is bizarrely off for a Daffy Duck cartoon. Instead of Elmer as the hunter, they instead opted for a Victor Moore parody played by the same actor. And he's nowhere near as fun of a character as Elmer is. There's also the little duckling who spends the entire cartoon crying and then getting angry anytime anyone talks to him. That got old really, really fast. Daffy's mere presence and a few good gags like the barrel and fence gag put it into watchable territory, but man, do I wish this one was better. A Gruesome Twosome. I do wish the setup didn't take as long as it did, but this is old school Bob Clampett doing his usual shtick, like with the dog gag. And of course, old school sadistic Tweety is always a blast to watch, even if he's not in here as much as I would like. A Tale of Two Mice. The return of Babbitt and Catcello, only now they're mice, for some reason. Anyway, this is passable enough, got a few okay gags, but nothing that really stands out. Wagon Heels. This is another Bob Clampett color remake, this time of Engine Trouble. There are a few new gags in here that are pretty good, and the timing's hair better. And plus, I just like that Sloppy Mo has blue skin with a green beard. That is just so random, but for whatever reason, I like that change. I'd call this one a marginal improvement over the original. Hair Conditioned. Yet another strong Bugs outing. This time with a real formidable foe with a store manager who also happens to be a taxidermist. The elevator gag in particular is a real treat, as is the bedroom slippers joke. A shockingly risque joke I'm surprised the Hayes office let slide. Fresh Airedale. You want to talk about cruel? This might be the single most cynical piece of animation in the entire Warner Brothers catalog. And given this is Looney Tunes we're talking about, that is saying a lot. The premise of this one is that the main character, Shep, is a dog who, on the surface to his master, is a faithful, loyal dog. But underneath is actually a nasty, vindictive piece of work who is petty, spiteful, and pretty much every other negative adjective you can think of. And every selfish act he partakes in benefits him. Meanwhile, the cat of the house is actually good, honest, and always trying to do the right thing. And yet he always gets treated like crap and always gets the short end of the stick every time he tries to do the right thing. And the ending absolutely does not soften the blow of the depressing sociopathy on display here. This is completely fascinating work by Chuck Jones. Like, on the surface, this seems to be a mere subversion of the dogs are good and cats are bad tropes that are so common in cartoons. But the presentation of this entire thing, whether intentionally or not, injects some rather fascinating subtext. I mean, think about it. The whole point of the cartoon is the dog is treated as a hero solely because he's a dog, and the cat is treated as a pariah solely because he's a cat. There's definitely a lot that you can read into in here. And of course, the bitter ending teaches the harsh moral that sometimes the wicked wind up getting praised for the good deeds that you did, while you wind up, at best, ignored and at worst, shunned. Not exactly a feel-good moral, but I can definitely understand people who say they either love or hate this cartoon. And yeah, I didn't like this much when I first saw it, but upon rewatching it and re-examining it, I find this to be a masterpiece from Chuck Jones. Now, is it funny? I wouldn't say that, but it is one that I deeply respect. The Bashful Buzzard. I said in the last video that I loved Beaky Buzzard as a character, and yeah, that still hasn't changed. It really is such a tragedy that his voice actor Kent Rogers died so young. Anyway, lots of excellent gags in this one, most prominently the I am not Dumbo gag. Peck Up Your Troubles. Pretty much exactly like a Sylvester and Tweety cartoon, only without any dialogue, a much meaner ending, and with a Woody Woodpecker XP instead of Tweety. It also takes the tomato gag from the heckling hare a step further by having the woodpecker trying to guilt trip Sylvester into committing suicide afterwards. Hair Tonic. The beginning almost feels like an apology from Chuck Jones for directing Elmer's Pet Rabbit. And the rest of the cartoon is pretty funny too. Elmer and Bugs do their thing again, with Bugs being particularly cruel. Also, I love how Bugs literally calls his doctor disguise Dr. Kill Patient. Nasty Quacks. This is once again Frank Tashlin at his chaotic best, and Daffy Duck being a menace to absolutely everything, and literally using a little girl as a human shield to be even worse than usual. Fantastic stuff in here. Book Review. Yet another book covers come to life cartoons. The first one in quite some time. Only this one bizarrely has a lot of energy and passion thrown into it, far more so than usual. Baseball Bugs. A magnificent Bugs Bunny cartoon, and the best since his debut. This cartoon has Bugs at some of his very best, managing to strike a perfect balance between laid back, aggressive, and playful, to say nothing of the insanely fast pace of the gags, and just how many of them are home runs. Really, Bugs is an all-American hero, and this cartoon is proof of it. Holiday for Shoestrings. A barely passable, but otherwise kind of blandly generic music-based cartoon, that at this point in the Looney Tunes Merry Melodies catalog, feels almost a decade out of place. Like, I wouldn't go out of my way to avoid this or anything, but this is the definition of basic and banal. Quentin Quayle. The people complaining about how annoying Tweety Bird would eventually get really need to watch this cartoon. Just listen to Baby Toots' aggravating voice and personality and understand that it could have been much, 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 much worse. Apparently the entire thing is a reference to an old radio program called Baby Snooks. I'd never heard of it, I'm just bringing it up. This feather gag in particular is good, and some of the other slapstick gags are done pretty well, but the voice of Baby Toots really brings this one down quite a bit. Baby Bottleneck. Bob Clampett uses the baby boom craze to tell as many jokes about babies and stork deliveries as he can. This is fast-paced, fun stuff, and the last-minute conflict between Daffy and Porky is also wacky and zany and well-earned. Hair Remover. And it is with this cartoon that we officially say goodbye to Frank Tashlin. Man, do I wish he had stuck around, because if he had, he could have easily been as much of a household name as Chuck Jones, because his great cartoons are just wonderful. And while I wouldn't call this one great, this is definitely not a bad one to go out on. It's got some wonderful chaotic energy. While I wish more time was devoted to the bare misunderstanding, this is still a real good time. Daffy Doodles. Bob McKimson makes his grand entrance, and yeah, he makes quite the good, solid first impression with this wacky chase cartoon. This cartoon never lags for a second, and I love how this cartoon portrays Daffy's vandalism of drawing mustaches as almost a compulsion that he can't control. And honestly, Daffy and Porky's chemistry, whether they're playing friends or enemies, is simply unparalleled. Hollywood Canine Canteen. Dog puns. Lots and lots of dog puns. None of them are really great, but this is largely inoffensive fluff. Hush My Mouse. And it is with this cartoon that we finally bid a fond farewell to Sniffles the Mouse. Well, okay, not exactly a fond farewell, but his last few cartoons actually weren't that bad. And this continues that tradition with an enjoyable mouse versus cat cartoon. Sniffles actually comes across as something resembling a force of nature this time around, which kind of makes me a little bit curious as to what would have come from this character if Chuck Jones had decided to continue with him. Hair-raising hair. This has an incredible atmosphere, and the location for this one is stellar, with the castle being well-defined. The monster Gossamer is also a ton of fun. He's got an absolutely perfect design, and he is an incredible combination of both scary, but also inefficient. Once again, Bugs is fantastic, and the gags are firing on all cylinders. Most prominently, the doctor in the house joke, which I'm honestly surprised they hadn't done up to this point. The only weird thing about this one is that the scientist pretty much vanishes after 2 minutes in. I know these cartoons aren't really about plot, but still, it feels weird that he doesn't even get some kind of slapstick comeuppance or anything. Still, that's largely a nitpick for what's otherwise a classic cartoon. Kitty Cornered. More Bob Clampett unfiltered insanity. The movement in this cartoon feels particularly over the top for some reason, but I mean that in the best possible way. Hollywood Daffy. It's more of Daffy doing his thing to a poor studio cop, mixed in with an occasional celebrity parody of the era. I will say it is weird though that out of all the cartoons Friz Freleng made, this is the one that he drew the line at and refused to finish, necessitating Holly Pratt to step in and finish it. Especially when, honestly, it's just fine. I mean, not great, but it's far from being one of the worst things he's ever made. Acrobat-y Bunny. Relatively mid-Bugs cartoon, namely because the antagonist lion in this one is such a boring character, especially when compared to the lion that Bugs went up against in Hold the Lion, Please. But don't get me wrong, mid-Bugs, especially during this era, is still perfectly enjoyable. I especially enjoyed this elephant gag in particular. The Eager Beaver. Another Chuck Jones one-shot. Those can tend to be kind of hit or miss, and this one's okay. The timing in this one's a little bit off at times, but overall, it's enjoyable, kind of cute, with just a touch of cynicism. The Great Piggy Bank Robbery. Just fantastic. Nearly every frame is brimming with energy and creativity and love, as it's very obvious that Bob Clampett had an affinity for Dick Tracy, almost as much as Daffy himself does. This cartoon is so great that even just watching Daffy read a newspaper is a real treat. And what makes this such a wonderful homage is that even if you know nothing about Dick Tracy, this is still delightful and easy to follow, and the ending fight scene is one of the greatest set pieces in all of Looney Tunes history. Definitely a must-watch. Bacall to Arms. This is one of the cartoons that was left unfinished when Bob Clampett left the studio, and they decided to fill out that time not only by having Art Davis finishing it, but also by literally reusing old footage from She Was an Acrobat's Daughter. The clips are integrated well enough, I guess. Like, if you didn't know that they were taken from an older cartoon, it would be hard to tell. But I'm really not a fan of recycling footage in this way. It just feels lazy. The wolf is also very clearly meant to be an XP for the wolf from Red Hot Riding Hood. Overall, it's an alright experience, I suppose. A few decent moments and sight gags, like this slapping gag, do help. Of the Ice Sting. This one is just bizarre. And what I mean by that is that this one's mere existence is baffling to me. This was released almost a year after the war had come to an end, and yet it feels exactly like a wartime propaganda cartoon. And the decision to use as an allegory for the Allied soldiers to be cast as mosquitoes is an interesting artistic decision, to say the least. One might even argue a touch insensitive, especially when you consider the time period it came out in. But it's possible that I'm reading into this a little bit too much. But even as a short, this just didn't do a thing for me. None of the gags really land, like, at all. While not terrible, this is definitely one of the lesser cartoons of this era. Walkie Talkie Hockey. The first appearances of both Foghorn Leghorn and the Backyard Dog, as well as the reintroduction of Henry Hawk. And boy, did they just come swinging out of the gate with this fast-moving, hilarious cartoon with lots of wonderful moments. Both Foghorn and the dog have incredible personalities, and the dynamic between them is quickly established. And honestly, Foghorn Leghorn might actually be one of my favorite Looney Tunes characters. Namely because of just how unpredictable he is. Sometimes he's the hero, sometimes he's the villain, and sometimes he's just a victim of circumstance, and he's equally great at all of them. Racketeer Rabbit. Another absolute classic Bugs cartoon. Pretty much every single gag in here, from the sword gag and the pie gag, are all executed very well. I also love several of the subtler moments too, like when Hugo takes Bugs for a ride, and Bugs simply returns without Hugo, only saying he won't bother us anymore. I love that we never actually find out what Bugs did to Hugo. You can fill in the blanks and have it be as silly or as dark as you want it to be, and honestly, I love it. This is also technically Rocky's first appearance in a Looney Tunes cartoon, although his design in this cartoon is a lot closer to Edward G. Robinson rather than his well-known design. This is actually one of the few Bugs cartoons I actually hadn't seen prior to undertaking this project, so I'm glad that I finally saw it, because I find this to be one of Bugs' best appearances. Fair and Warmer. For this one, the idea is definitely there, but there are simply too many moving parts for such a short runtime. I mean, you have the worm trying to get the apple, the bird trying to get the worm, the cat trying to get the bird, the dog trying to get the cat, and the dog catcher trying to catch the dog. Maybe if this had double the runtime to work with, it could have worked, but even so, for the little time they had to work with, Chuck Jones really tries his hardest here. And there's definitely some good gags in here, like the wife and mouse gag. Maybe if Jones was at the absolute top of his game, this could have been one of the all-time greats. But as is, this is perfectly good and solid. The Big Snooze. This was the cartoon that Bob Clampett was right in the middle of directing when he left Warner Brothers, so it had to be finished by Art Davis. What makes this so interesting is that this cartoon also features Elmer Fudd quitting Warner Brothers, in this case by literally tearing up his own contract. I honestly don't know what to make of that, but that's just fascinating to me. Also, this cartoon reuses the log gag from All This and Rabbit Stew. So if you ever wanted to see it without the blackface, this would be the place to do it. And the rest of the short is pretty good too. Bugs entering Elmer's dream and turning it into a nightmare gives way to some unstructured psychedelic chaos, and it is creative. Although the pacing can definitely feel off at times, no doubt due to Art Davis cutting out a lot of what Clampett had originally planned for the cartoon. The Mouse-merized Cat. The return of Babbitt and Catcello, once again as mice. For some reason. And like I said before, these aren't really parodies of Abbott and Costello, because they don't really act that differently from their real-life counterparts. And honestly, nobody could do their shtick better than they could, at least of all two impressions. As a short, this one's okay-ish. Most of the cartoon is just the two mice trying to hypnotize the other. This isn't great, but it's not terrible. The harebrained hypnotist utilized hypnosis way, way better. Mouse Menace. The mounted lion gag was unexpectedly cruel, but very welcome and funny. Aside from that one gag, this is pretty standard stuff. It's perfectly fine. Rhapsody Rabbit. If you ever needed proof that Bugs could get away with murder at this point, all you have to do is literally see him shoot a man while on stage just for coughing, and not a single person bats an eye at it. Anyway, like a lot of music-based cartoons of the era, it's got some rhythm to it, and the slapstick gags work very well. But, of course, you can't talk about this cartoon without talking about the controversies surrounding the Cat Concerto. For those that don't know, there was a Tom and Jerry cartoon that was released around the same time as this one, which has more or less the same premise of a character trying to play Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2 on the piano while a mouse is inside it, and the two end up going to war. The similarities in both cartoons' plots were so similar that it led to both Warner Brothers and MGM accusing the other of plagiarism. Me personally, I'm not really interested in the plagiarism controversy in and of itself, but I did want to bring it up. And in case you're wondering, I do think the Cat Concerto is a little bit better. The slapstick's a lot punchier, and the gags feel a little bit more organic and flow better. But that's not to put this cartoon down by any means. This has a lot of great moments like the typewriter gag and the feet gag. It's enjoyable, fast-moving, and funny. Roughly Squeaking. This one's a real blast. Huey and Birdie's act can be very hit or miss, but this one just completely nails it. A lot of the imagery in this one is absolutely perfectly absurd, and the reactions from the characters are also hilarious, like the bird who's watching this entire thing unfold. One Meat Brawl. While I would hesitate to call this one great, that rather annoying song at the start does not do this one any favors. There are some great reactions and top-notch movement in this one, like when the groundhog first comes out of the hole and the cameras quickly switch to guns. The shoe gag was another gag that, in theory, shouldn't work, but the execution actually makes it funny. The Goofy Gophers. The Goofy Gophers officially make their debut, and this one's alright. I don't think they've got their personalities down quite yet. They kind of come across as stereotypical screwballs, but they also just happen to be polite. Two personality traits that don't really mesh together very well. Still, it's got a few decent slapstick moments and a good solid ending punchline. The Gay Aunties. I really don't understand Friz Freleng. He can go from making some fun, sharp, fast-moving cartoons 1 minute, particularly his Bugs cartoons, and then immediately go into making something bland, boring, and generic. I thought these kind of bouncy, lacking in substance cartoons would have died out by now, but no, every once in a while one will just pop right back. I guess it's not awful, but this is definitely not good. Oh, and it includes a musical number that the cartoon itself admits is irritating to listen to. Yeah, here's a tip. If you know something is annoying and irritating to listen to, maybe don't put it in your cartoon. Sentimental Over You. Alright, fine. We might as well talk about Pepe Le Pew as a character here, since this cartoon is a lot closer to what's seen as a typical Pepe Le Pew cartoon. Now, I already mentioned the outdated stereotype that at least aspects of this character are based on. And of course, the character has come under fire in recent years because the entire basis for his character is sexual harassment. So much so that Warner Brothers actually removed him as a character from Space Jam 2, which, considering how bad that film was probably more of a blessing than a curse, to be honest. And I want to throw my 2 cents here. Me personally, while I do understand the argument being made, the Looney Tunes characters honestly were never meant to be paragons of virtue. Many of the main characters that we, the audience, are supposed to root for can be violent, sadistic, thieves, and even gaslighters. So honestly, after having sat through hundreds of cartoons by this point, this doesn't even really seem that bad. And that's not even taking into account the context of when he came out. See, something that tends to get lost in the modern era is that Pepe Le Pew is supposed to be a parody of the male romantic lead in films. Like, if you've ever seen a romance film during the 40s and 50s, you know how creepy some of the men can sometimes come across when flirting and pursuing the female lead. Now, in the film, it's usually seen as cute and playful, but Pepe is meant to be a parody of that. What if that same male lead who thought he was so charming was actually completely repulsive to the women that he was chasing? And given how the females in these cartoons actually act to his behavior accordingly, I personally don't see anything wrong with the character in principle. It just depends on how you utilize him. Now, as for the short itself, this is actually pretty good. Some good movement, facial expressions, and I love this quick gag of Pepe salting the key before swallowing it. Really, the thing that makes this cartoon stand out so much is the ending gag, in which Pepe also reveals himself to be a dog, only to reveal that he was actually a skunk pretending to be a dog pretending to be a skunk. That's just a wonderful bit. A Hair Grows in Manhattan. I'm not entirely sure what the point is of having the framing device of Bugs recounting his biography, when the entire second half of this cartoon is devoted simply to a fight between him and a dog gang leader. That being said, the fight is definitely entertaining once it begins, including the dog pile on the rabbit bit and the Egyptian cigarette gag. Birth of a Notion. Is the setup a bit too long? A little bit, but this cartoon manages to have some great overreactions and even a few underreactions, courtesy of the Peter Lorre caricature. I also love how the cartoon literally stops the chase scene just to bring Leopold the dog back to remind you that, yes, he is still in the cartoon. Tweety Pie. So, this cartoon is famous for a number of reasons. For starters, and most obviously, this was the first pairing of Sylvester the Cat, called Thomas in this cartoon, and Tweety Bird. This was also the first Warner Brothers cartoon after 17 years of making cartoons, where they finally won the Academy Award for Best Short Subject Cartoons, which was likely at least part of the reason why more Sylvester and Tweety cartoons were made. This was also the cartoon in which Tweety's more violent Bob Clampett personality was drastically toned down via Friz Freeling. Not so much so that there's no trace of it, but you can definitely tell he's been toned down significantly. Now, I know a lot of people hate this version of Tweety, think he's too cutesy and all that, but I'm sorry, I sat through all the Harmon Ising cartoons, the Buddy cartoons, the Blabbermouth cartoons, and the Sniffles cartoons. I just don't think he's anywhere near as annoying or cloying as a lot of people make him out to be. Now, granted, maybe that's also because I grew up on Sylvester and Tweety cartoons, but as a character, he just never bothered me. Anyway, it's easy to see why this cartoon spawned a Looney Tunes formula. The chemistry from these two is remarkable, and it's brilliantly paced. The setup, the character interactions, and the timing in between the gags are all excellently spaced out for maximum effect. I found myself laughing really hard during a lot of this cartoon, which is impressive since I've seen this one multiple times before. I love it. Rabbit Transit. This is the third and final cartoon in the Tortoise and the Hare series of cartoons. And what makes this one interesting is that Bugs has been really firmly established as a character for a while when compared to the other two, so his personality is actually a lot cooler than in the first two, where he's far more of a hothead. And yet, all the while, it still has him fall for the same karmic trickster gags. And because by this point audiences had gotten used to Bugs always coming out on top, the ending is a rather cruel subversion of what they were likely expecting back in 1947. And the one step up that this cartoon has when compared to the first two is that the pacing is a lot better. Really great, but I am glad that they stopped after this cartoon, otherwise I think it would have gotten stale. Hobo Bobo. Turns out Bob McKimson can do cute quite a bit better than Chuck Jones. Who knew? Also, the narrator in this is hilarious, and I really don't think Robert C. Bruce gets enough credit for his voice acting work. Along Came Daffy. Daffy Duck goes up against someone closely resembling Yosemite Sam and his brother? Cousin? In fact, do we ever see this guy again? You know what? I'm going to assume that it's canon that Yosemite Sam ate his brother in order to not starve to death. Anyway, jokes aside, this one's a good solid chase cartoon. Lots of good manic energy and timing. Inky at the Circus. By far the best Inky cartoon to date. Although I have to admit, I'm still surprised to see him pop up this late in the catalog considering his design. This feels like Chuck Jones temporarily going back to his roots and combining both his Curious Puppy cartoons and his Inky cartoons. And the result is a mild but still enjoyable little cartoon. None of the gags are really laugh out loud, but the timing is mostly really solid and the slapstick is perfectly passable. And like his other Inky cartoons, I always appreciate it when Chuck Jones goes dialogueless in his cartoons. Easter Yeggs. Another really fun Bugs Bunny outing, even if the plot does seem a little bit too random in some spots. Like how the cartoon kind of forgets about the Easter plot before working its way back in. Plus, it's always kind of fun to watch a beloved Looney Tunes character just trying to beat the crap out of a young kid. Also, there's this multiply joke. One of the best examples so far of sneaking a joke past the censors. And that's it. We have officially reached the halfway point. And man, oh man, was this a strong collection of cartoons. Not only did this group of 100 have the least amount of bad cartoons in it, it also contains some truly fantastic ones. A whopping 12 cartoons managed to receive my highest possible rating. While these cartoons have been getting better and better for a while now, this is where Looney Tunes really began to hit its stride. They finally found their groove, and honestly, I couldn't be happier. Watching all these back-to-back was so incredibly easy for me, and comparing all of these to the really early days with cartoons that were pretty much indistinguishable from each other is honestly like night and day. In terms of what's coming for the next 100 cartoons, we will be leaving the 40s behind and heading into the 1950s, a decade which will feature some of the most iconic Looney Tunes cartoons of all time. And in the next 100, we're going to see a lot more characters that were introduced this time around, like Foghorn Leghorn and Sylvester and Tweety, including Sylvester actually getting his official name. And we'll also see for the first time Charlie Dog's official debut, Marvin the Martian, Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner, and Penelope Pussycat. There's going to be some great cartoons in here, and I can't wait to revisit them. And I guess that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. As always, the links to parts 1 through 4 are in the description below. And if you want to be notified of when part 6 comes out, make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss it. Anyway, have a good day, and I'll see you next time.